Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Iram Gonzalez. I'll be your host for this morning's Spooky Stories, Cautionary Tales from the Cyber Crypt. Our goal is to have a fun and engaging time. Should you have any questions throughout the presentation, there is a Q&A section that you can feel free to put in questions, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Jerry Craig join us. He's with Ntiva. He's the head of cybersecurity for Ntiva. He's got quite a number of credentials associated with his title, but and he's also a professor of cybersecurity. He's going to be joining us and giving us some nice insight throughout, giving us some perspective and giving us some good ways that we can protect ourselves and protect our businesses. All right, so the format for today is we're going to give you some stories. The stories will then have some dialogue between myself and Mark Benedetto, who's also our SVP of sales, and obviously Dr. Jerry. The stories, although they are taken from real life scenarios, the names have been changed to protect the innocent. So if you have any questions about the stories, like I said, just feel free to put those in the Q&A or in the chat. Without further ado, let's get down to the first story, the phantom email. At Titanium Manufacturing, everything seemed normal as the CFO, Karen Davis, sifted through her emails late on a Friday afternoon. The sun was setting, casting eerie shadows across her office, and she was eager to finish up for the week. Among the clutter of invoices and budget reports, an email caught her eye. The subject line was innocuous: immediate payment required, confidential, which came from her CEO, Mike Reynolds. The email was unsettlingly specific. It referenced an urgent overseas deal with one of their biggest suppliers. Mike, traveling in a distant time zone, instructed Karen to wire $250,000 by end of day. The email chain was perfect. Previous exchanges between Karen and Mike were attached, all with correct dates and tone. The email even had a subtle urgency, as if Mike was pleading for her help. The company depended on this deal, and any delay could send shockwaves through the entire supply chain. The clock ticked closer to 6 p.m. and the office had grown eerily quiet. Karen felt a chill, but she brushed it off, telling herself it was just the fall weather settling in. She glanced at the email address, and though something in her gut told her something wasn't right, everything looked legitimate at first glance. Mike at titanium-manufacturing.com. One tiny typo. The I was changed for a 1, but Karen's eyes were tired, and the adrenaline of closing such a deal drowned out any concerns. Without a second thought, she initiated the wire transfer. It was only after the funds left the account that the creeping unease turned into icy panic. The phone rang, startling her. It was Mike. His voice was calm but confused. Karen, did you send any wire today? I didn't approve any payments. Karen's blood ran cold as the truth slowly dawned on her. The real Mike never sent that email. It was all a carefully orchestrated ploy crafted by someone lurking in the shadows of their company's communications. The hackers had been watching, learning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They knew who to impersonate, which words to use, and how to mimic the CEO's style, down to the smallest detail. As the IT team scrambled to trace the origins of the hack, they found the digital fingerprints of a cybercriminal group that had been inside the company's system for months, observing every move. The chilling realization hit Karen. They knew more about Titanium than she did. Now, this is clearly a phishing success story from the hacker standpoint and what would now be classified as a business email compromise. Dr. Jerry, can you give us a little bit of insight or your thoughts on methods or perhaps training, which we have found at the Purple Guys to be the best way to mitigate the risk associated with phishing attempts, training and different methods that can be used to mitigate the risk?
From a training perspective, it's always good to include some form of phishing campaign training, ideally at least once a month, so that you can get accustomed to seeing phishing campaigns, picking out and spotting the things that are those red flags that you should be looking for. So it becomes more of a habit, not just a once in a while we do this. Annual security awareness training is extremely helpful because not only is it going to teach you about the basics, if it's a good program, it's also teaching you kind of like the current events that are taking place throughout the world. So you're going to get real world scenarios that they're seeing that year, and each year when they update their training, they're going to update it to the next set of things that takes place. So you're going to kind of see that. One thing I would also point out here is that, you know, we didn't talk about the size of this company, but I do work with a lot of clients who believe that maybe they're not that important. The data and the work that they do is not that important. They're not, maybe if they're not in the defense industry, they're not worried about a nation state coming after them. But really, anybody is susceptible to this. And most of the time, these attacks are less targeted than you think, and they're more widespread, like nets. So please don't, please don't drop your level of vigilance here, thinking that why would anyone do this to you? You're not important.
Very good. So a couple of other things, I mentioned it briefly earlier. More often than not, if your gut's telling you something's not right, you should obviously go through with that, double check, verify. And then anytime that there's wire transfers, most of the organizations that I work with directly would want to have a two-person approval process with any wire transfer, right? Where we want to make sure that there is not just person that can start and initiate the process and also execute on it, but one person starts it, the other person executes it. So you have that system of control that's built into that particular scenario. So yes, the email compromise happened, but if there were other controls in place outside of just the email, then you may have been able to avoid a similar scenario. And then the other thing with the training and whatnot, that just elevates your level of vigilance. And can't say that enough. You always have to be vigilant. When in doubt, if there's any doubt whatsoever, contact your IT professional, whether that's an MSP, whether that's an individual person, have them verify, confirm it, see if it passes the smell test.
Yeah, one other thing
Right.
I'd add to that is you
Yep.
brought up a great point about the process, like a two-person check and balance in place. That's fantastic. I'd extend that to not only wire transfers, but to the changing of bank routing information. Company comes and says, hey, we've switched over to this bank, or we've got a new account. We want to switch over our stuff for invoicing purposes. Implement the same type of process for that as well, because the first step in a lot of these attacks is just to get you to swap over to a different account that you're used to processing payments and invoices with on a monthly basis. And before you know it, you're sending out money and it's not even a wire transfer request. It's just part of normal business.
Yep. Very good. All right. Our second scenario.
By the
Oh,
way, Ivan, just to add one thing to that last one, I would actually say from a non-technical standpoint, I've seen this a handful of times with clients in the past, and very difficult for an IT service provider in some scenarios to stop that because they're essentially clicking on those emails, they're wiring those funds, etc. I feel like a lot of recommendations we make to clients is just kind of a trust but verify, right? If something seems off, if it seems like a transfer of money or something like that that's out of the ordinary, reach out, pick up the phone, call the person, confirm that that is actually a request that they made, because that's where we typically see it. Because a lot of the emails that my clients in the past have, moved forward on or transferred that money, they looked incredibly good. So I think, picking up the phone in some of those scenarios and just asking that question, was this an actual request, can avoid a lot of this as well.
Yeah, a couple other things. You brought up a good point. So, prior to ChatGPT, we had a lot of overseas attackers or threat actors that were crafting emails, and they were pretty blatantly obvious that they were fake, right? I mean, you would read them, there'd be misspellings. You could tell it wasn't a native English speaking person crafting them. but they've gotten better over time. AI and ChatGPT type products have made it very easy to mimic, a native English speaker, so they look more realistic. So pay attention to those things as well. I would even say that in this particular scenario, we know that the email address was misspelled and it was just overlooked. However, Iram, as you stated, the person was able to mimic how the requester speaks, so their tone, the language, the types of words they use. If they have that much, let's call it knowledge, or they've done some reconnaissance, they could have intercepted other emails and learned how this person spoke so that they sound more realistic in their email. They also could have compromised one or more actual mailboxes in the organization. So if something like this comes up and it's not blatantly obvious that this was a one-time event, I would maybe look at having an investigation into your environment to see if potentially your office environment or Google environment has been hacked. The other thing I wanted to point out was very unique to this situation because the dollar amount was chosen at $250,000. I do believe that threat actors are intelligent in the way they craft what they do and what they ask for. That dollar amount is important because a lot of insurance, cyber insurance premiums, deductibles, whatever they're calling them, they often are set at $250,000. So they're trying to get you to transfer enough money that it's not too large that you're like, why would I transfer $1 million? But at the same case, you're probably not going to reach out to your cyber provider. You're probably not going to be able to invoke the policy, even if you have one, because you're out the 250K to them. Now you'd have to be out another 250K to your provider. So I think they craft those things purposely to make it small enough that you cut your losses and don't tell anyone because, in addition to a reputational perspective. So just be vigilant about those things. Again, if someone was asking to wire $100, you're not that you shouldn't show the same vigilance, but you're probably not going to worry as much, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Absolutely. All right. Hey, I meant to say this also earlier. There is a Q&A section up in at the top of the screen. You should see a Q&A option button, whatever you want to call it. As you have questions, if you have any questions come up, you can type those in there, and at the end there will be a Q&A session, and we'll be glad to address any questions that you may have for any of these stories or any of these scenarios. All right, so let's move on to the second one. So the second one is titled The Silent Invasion. And this one was very common here not too long ago. So let's get right into it. It started quietly at Blue Horizon Software, the company powering hundreds of car dealerships across the country. One routine-looking email to a contractor led to the malware infiltration. The attackers lay low for weeks, silently embedding themselves deep into Blue Horizon's systems. On October 13th, they struck. Suddenly, Blue Horizon's network froze. The screens across the company displayed the same chilling message. Your files have been encrypted, pay 10 million in Bitcoin, or your data will remain locked. The attack had spread through their entire infrastructure, encrypting their backups and cloud systems, and more disturbingly, reaching every dealership connected to their platform. The dealerships were blindsided. Carmont Motors in New York couldn't access their inventory system, halting all sales. In California, a luxury car dealer had to cancel a high-ticket transaction mid-sale, losing a valuable client. Midtown Autos in Texas saw their entire service department grind to a halt. Without Blue Horizon systems, mechanics couldn't retrieve work orders or repair histories, leaving cars untouched and customers furious. Smaller dealerships like Graves Automotive were devastated. They relied entirely on Blue Horizon for every aspect of their business, ordering vehicles, managing customer data, even processing payroll. Within a week, Graves Automotive shuttered, unable to cope with the operational freeze. The Marlowe Group, which owned hundreds of dealerships, faced overwhelming losses, furloughing employees and leaving sales deals in limbo. The ripple effects were catastrophic. Over 300 dealerships felt the sting of Blue Ring's breach, and while some managed to survive, many never fully recovered. The attack didn't just cripple Blue Horizon, it sent shockwaves through an entire industry. Now, in this particular scenario, what's important to take from this is that it wasn't the company, the end user, if you will. It wasn't our company. It wasn't the dealership that was impacted directly from the breach. It was a vendor that they utilized in some cases for a part of their business, in other cases all of their business, that was compromised. And what happened in this particular scenario, which is very true to life, is that the impact was felt mostly to the end user in this case, aka the dealerships, and not to the vendor directly, at least not initially. So sure, they had a reputational hit and they had a couple of other things. So, ultimately there was how do you protect yourself, I guess, is the question here, right? How do you protect yourself in a scenario where you are relying on a particular vendor, whether that's Microsoft in their cloud, whether it's a application that you utilize in the financial sector? Some people utilize Thomson Reuters, and that's perhaps a cloud-based system. If that system's not available, what do you do? That kind of scenario. So, Dr. Jerry, if you could talk to us a little bit about in this scenario, what can companies do to try to mitigate the risk associated with being so locked in with a specific vendor?
Yeah, one of the first things you can do in the security space and IT space, we call it a business impact analysis. Some people call it a business impact assessment, but a BIA. And one of the things that you're going to do in this BIA process is you're going to start documenting all of your critical infrastructure, personnel, processes, procedures, etc. And what you're really looking for are these types of systems or vendors or people, maybe it's people who have knowledge of your environment, who are essentially single points of failures. And that's what really this was. This was a single point of failure at the vendor level that all of these dealerships were using. So within your own organization, you start and you look at, what do I have? Is it payroll? Is it HR related? If you're an MSP, is it a ticketing system? If that one system went down, how would it impact my business, and could I continue to conduct business? For how long? How would I be impacted, et cetera? The next thing you do is, once you've identified vendors, you start looking at those vendors. Does that vendor, and you brought up Microsoft, Microsoft's one of the biggest vendors in the world. They have a lot of replication and high availability set up so that if one of their zones goes down, they immediately cut over. But that doesn't mean they're immune to crashing completely either. You see that with Amazon sometimes on Black Friday, that kind of thing. When you're trying to explain this though internally, and you're trying to get people to support this type of exercise, think at the smallest scale and work up. So if you have an office, and let's say your folks are still working out of an office, maybe you've got servers there, whatever the case may be. How many times have you seen somebody come into that office space and outside someone cuts a Verizon line or a Comcast line accidentally, and you lose internet for a couple days? Everybody has to go home. That's becoming less and less of a thing as people work remote. You can get a second internet connection, et cetera. But think in that way and then start to scale it up. What if my server goes down? Even if you've created you've got a backup location for a piece of software, there's nothing that says that you've protected all of the data and replicated the data. You might stand up the new server and then have no data to be able to populate it with. So really start small, do the BIA, work your way up is my recommendation.
Yeah, I love this one. I think this is a great story because I think from a lot of times when we think of a security incident, we think about somebody clicking on something, someone internally making a mistake, someone coming after the network. And I think in my experience dealing with clients, they don't think about, what about their vendors? What is the security risk with the vendors? If the vendors have a security breach, how is that affecting them? And a contingency plan for that. So I think this was just a little bit different because I feel like most people think about security breaches and concerns internally and not about what happens with third parties.
And I'd say don't focus only on security, right? I mean, this is a security based presentation, But don't look at it just from the security perspective. I've worked in federal healthcare, and I've seen where lightning hits a building and it causes the power to be disrupted. Even though everything was on backup, UPSs, et cetera, had generators, it didn't just work. Things just didn't work. Like, things were impacted, and it took weeks to get back up. So look at your organization. Certainly go through all the security related items, but then look at the other things. What if you were broken into? What if there's a natural disaster? All these things apply, and the way that you go about resolving them or mitigating them might be the same way. So you may come up with 5 scenarios that could occur, and then get lucky that one thing mitigates all 5. Fantastic. But at least document those so that you know what you're trying to defend against.
Yeah, Dr. Jerry, well, last thing I would mention is, would you agree that a lot of people think about security as a breach, a tool, a control, something that's going to stop the breach, but a lot of times what they're not taking into account is the business impact, the business process. What is the process if something is to happen? What is the contingency plan? What are the next steps? What is the run book in a scenario like this? And I feel like, sometimes it's kind of modular where we're saying, okay, well, we have these controls in place, we should be good. But with the assumption that something happens, what is the process internally outside of IT, but from an actual business process standpoint, what are the next steps? What do we do?
Yeah, you're right, and I like analogies because I think it just makes it easier for everyone to understand if you're not in the security space. So just think about your home. The way we look at security controls and countermeasures would be things like making sure that there's a lock on every door and every window. If you wanted to beef up security, maybe you're putting bars on your windows. But just because you have a lock or just because you have bars does not mean that someone won't forget to lock something. It doesn't mean that someone can't still ram through the front door, right? So they're not 100% guarantees. And I think one of the things that we started coining a term was called left of boom years ago, which was, why don't we all just make the assumption that something bad is going to happen to each one of our companies at some point in time? And let's focus on what do we do after that happens? There's only so much time, money, and effort we're going to do and put into prevention. And we know budgets are very limited. They don't allow us to just keep growing. So, okay, let's just assume that we've done the best we can do and we get attacked tomorrow or we have one of these disasters. How do we manage after that? And one of the biggest questions, and you kind of hinted on it, was how long are you down? How long can the business afford to be down and not functioning before you have to close the doors? So many people get hung up on ransomware and paying a ransom, but in my experience with all of them, it comes down to how long can I function before I have to go, before I go bankrupt? And if that answer is 3 days, guess what? Then you've got to be up and running in less than 3 days. So those are the types of ways I think people should be looking at it. Don't focus on just, did I have the right tool in place?
Yeah, and I'll mention one more thing before we move on to the next story. I feel that in my experience, what I typically find is individuals that have ownership of what that disaster recovery plan looks like, what the expectation is around getting back up and running, is not always in line with leadership. So a recommendation I've always made to clients is make sure that what's realistic about getting back up and running is in line with leadership. And candidly, it seems kind of like common sense, but there's typically a disconnect there where if something is to happen, if there's a breach, if there's an issue, you realistically, if you own the IT side of things and the technical side of things, you know what it'll take. But is that meeting the expectations of leadership? And if not, there should be a contingency planning conversation there on how we get up and running to meet those business objectives.
Well, and you're pulling great threads, so I'm going to keep responding to what you're saying. I think everyone who's watching, whether, like you said earlier, whether they work with an MSP, they do the work internally themselves, this is another thing they really need to go back and look at. One of the common themes that I've seen with our customers is going out and downloading like a disaster recovery plan from the internet because you can find free templates. Going out and looking for Google searches and say what's best practice on X. And what you'll tend to see is as you review these plans, if a company has one, is that there will be unrealistic expectations in there. It'll say things like, I expect to be up and running in 4 hours. Okay, one, has the company decided that 4 hours is really the timeline that you need? And if so, have you worked with your MSP to say, hey, MSP, is it even possible to get me up in 4 hours? Do I have the right tools, the right things in place? You may have to buy more expensive tools, pay for more expensive services because your level of requirements is just greater than what the service can provide. You may find that it's cost prohibitive to do that, and instead you're going to deal with a 24-hour, return to service. These are great things that you want to find out in advance and make business decisions on and accept the risk on. You don't want to be this company when everything hits the fan and then realize that you have a piece of paper that says you'll be back up in 4 hours, but 4 days later you're still down. Like
It's
that's
not acceptable.
and that's the hardest thing to have to, to tell a client is, I know you're going through the worst day of your life, but hey, it's going to get worse, right? So better to go through the pain now than when this occurs.
Exactly. Not to digress, last thing to say that it's funny you brought that up about the backups. I feel like whenever I've had conversations in the past with clients and you talk about downtime, the answer is always zero downtime. We can't be down at all. At the same time, there's a price tag to that, right? Whether it's replication, disaster recovery, data center, Azure. And I feel like, you get some truth in the room when you really start talking about what's realistic about a recovery. And then suddenly there's a cost to value conversation that has to happen. And not all backup solutions were created equally. Not all disaster recovery solutions were created equally. So just to reiterate and kind of put a pin in that, I just think it's super important that you make sure that your expectations and what is realistic is on the same page with leadership, because I feel like that's where we see a lot of clients get in trouble. Is everything seems to be working as it should until something happens, and then what does it actually take to get us back up and running? So awesome.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about ransomware. The last story that we have for you guys today is titled, it's titled The Ransom That Wasn't Paid. So Petra Green, a mid-sized energy company, had always assumed their cybersecurity was, in air quotes here, good enough. They maintained a basic firewall, standard antivirus software, and routine backups. But beyond that, security wasn't really a priority. They didn't consider themselves a prime target for hackers. That sense of invincibility shattered on the night of October 29th. An email appeared in a junior accountant's inbox, seemingly a routine invoice from a regular vendor. But the moment the attachment was opened, ransomware infiltrated the network. It spread quickly, encrypting files and servers before anyone could react. Within hours, Petra Green was locked out of all their systems, their critical data held hostage. The attackers demanded $2 million in Bitcoin, with the threat that if it wasn't paid within 48 hours, all the data would be erased. The ransom demand spread panic through the company. They turned to their backups only to discover a horrifying truth. Their backups were also encrypted. They had made a critical error. There was no separation between the operational network and the backup environment, allowing the ransomware to infect both. In their desperation, Petra Green reached out to their insurance company, confident that their cyber insurance policy would cover the damage. That hope was quickly dashed. The claim was denied. The reason? Petra Green had failed to implement even the most basic security controls required by the policy. It turned out the company had no endpoint detection and response, EDR, and no managed detection and response, MDR, systems in place, leaving them blind to early signs of the attack. They lacked multi-factor authentication for sensitive accounts, allowing attackers to gain access using simple passwords. There was no network segmentation, which meant once the ransomware got in, it had free reign to spread across every system. Their employees hadn't undergone security awareness training, which would have helped identify phishing emails, the very type that started this nightmare. The insurance provider made it clear Petra Green hadn't adhered to the minimum security standards outlined in their policy. The company had been warned before about these shortcomings during a routine audit, but they never took action. As a result, the policy didn't cover the attack. Without the proper controls, Petra Green was left to deal with the fallout on their own. In a last-ditch effort, they attempted to negotiate with the hackers, but as the deadline approached, a negotiation stalled. The attackers followed through on their threat. The encrypted data was destroyed, leaving Petrogreen in ruins. Within weeks, they filed for bankruptcy, their operations crippled, and their reputation irreparably damaged. So in this story, this is becoming more and more common in my experience with some of our clients, or not with our clients, but in some scenarios with some clients, and that is that they feel that they're not a target. And Dr. Jerry alluded to this earlier. They also feel that they have sufficient controls in place, and that if something does happen, they're going to use their backups and they'll get back up and running in a day or two, and that's sufficient for them. You know, I guess, Dr. Jerry, if you could give us a little bit more insight as to what were some of the failures within this particular scenario, and what companies can do or should be doing to be able to safeguard their assets appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, the lack of EDR, that endpoint protection, the lack of MFA are the two biggest. And when you combine that with cyber insurance providers and plans and policies that come out now, those are almost a guaranteed must-have to even be insured these days, or at a minimum, be insured with a premium and deductible that you can afford and are willing to pay. So right off the bat, I would say that's huge. Another thing I would say, especially if we're talking about the small to medium business space, is that when most companies start out, and think back, you know, when whatever company you worked at started, you're going to start with 1, 2, 3 people, whatever it is. And as you grow, the network and infrastructure is normally a flat infrastructure. And what I mean by that is everybody's just connected laterally. There's usually no segmentation or segregation between types of assets, simply because when you're small, that's just how it works. And as you grow over time, if you don't plan for that growth, you could become a 200-person company with the same network infrastructure. Now, once the attacker attacks you, they have full reign across all of your assets because there was never anything put in place. I think people forget about that one because cyber insurance providers don't specifically call that out. It's not talked about as much, but that would be one of the bigger ones here, in addition, again, to EDR and MFA.
Gotcha. A couple of things that kind of stuck out when I went through this story was that their backups had been encrypted, and in this particular scenario, and this has played out many times in the past. This is not isolated to this particular company, obviously. You know, most people think that a backup is a backup and that you're good. In this case, the backup existed on the same network. It wasn't segmented. It wasn't VLANed off, whatever the term you want to use. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about that, and how potentially an immutable backup, when you layer that onto it, how that can be an additional level of protection?
Yeah, I mean, you know, roughly 20 plus years ago, when I got out of the military and started in this space, just kind of in the private sector, it was very common to go into whatever room held the networking equipment or the single server that the company had, and there would be a second PC that was being repurposed, and it was like a tape drive as backups. And somebody would go in there manually and change tapes, and they'd run backups. Well, obviously, if your network gets hacked, that machine is sitting on the network because it needs to back up the devices. It too is going to be affected. Companies moved up to bigger and more secure items, but a lot of times they were still on-prem or in their data center. What we're seeing more of, assuming folks are willing to spend the money on it, is to get off-site cloud backups, and then the cloud providers make replicant copies of that data. So one, you're separating your physical environment from the cloud environment, but then even if that cloud environment is hacked for some reason or compromised through a lateral movement, the provider actually could have a separate segmented copy of that even you don't have access to. So at least you could potentially get that data back. So I think that's the trend that most are going towards. And I think a lot of these tools and services are a lot more affordable than people think. It doesn't mean that it's more expensive necessarily that you're going to the cloud. especially when you start talking about getting with some of these large vendors that we partner with, because the sheer volume of business that's done with them allows them to drive the price point down. So if you're listening to this and you're still doing things manually and on site, I would definitely say reach out to whoever your provider is and have a discussion, because there are better, faster, safer, cheaper ways. And we're not even talking about the restoration process of, is it, how long will it take you to restore from that kind of legacy archaic system versus these new systems.
Yeah. One other thing I'd add is Dr. Jerry Iron, fact check me if you think I'm wrong on this, but I feel that in the past, cyber insurance was not something adopted by every company. And a lot of times it was larger companies, CFO, they saw the value in it. And I think, in my personal opinion, I'm seeing smaller companies that realize that they may even have more of a need for cyber insurance in a scenario where they're breached, because they don't have the funds and the bank account and the financial stability to be able to work themselves through that. And what I've also seen, in my opinion, is where cybersecurity and insurance used to just be a checkbox. You check a box, you get a premium. If something happens, you call on it. In my opinion, we've seen more and more clients, as breaches continue to increase and there's more frequency of it, is that insurance companies are really starting to dig in after the fact. And I don't want to make this sound negative for insurance companies, because I think they're doing a good job in a lot of ways, but they're looking for ways to show that you have not done due diligence. And security, in my opinion, is not a point in time implementation. You implement something great, but it's about ongoing due diligence, what you're doing to continue to refine that strategy. And it's an ongoing process, not something that you do one time, check a box, and hope that if something happens, you get approved on the policy. So if there's any thoughts there, feel free to chime in. I've just seen a shift where, as the frequency of these types of events happen, candidly, insurance companies are doing more scrutiny on should they approve these policies and these payouts.
Yeah, well, the truth is, and we, Ntiva partners with some insurance folks that could certainly help out if anybody needs the help reviewing policies, renewing policies, getting a policy. And a lot of the information that they disseminate is that, insurance companies took a bath the first few years on cyber insurance. At the beginning, maybe there really weren't cyber events or that many, fine. But then as the number of events grew, they were really taking losses. And they had to figure out ways to kind of prevent these losses. And denying claims isn't really the best way to do that. It was to start to implement minimum requirement mandates, things like MFA and EDR, to where they won't even insure you if you don't have it, or they'll make your premium so high that they're going to essentially recover a lot of their losses. So that's really driven people to start putting things in place. The other thing I'm seeing is, and it may be industry specific, so I'll use DoD as an example. If you want to be a subcontractor to a prime, let's say one of the big five primes, right? They won't do business with you and allow you to bid on their RFPs as a subcontractor unless you have insurance and certain amounts. Well, if you don't have the controls in place, you're not going to get those, and that's going to take you out of the game. You can't even compete. So we're seeing, we're seeing it come from insurance sides. We're seeing it come from big corporations. Even your own clients, depending on what industry you're in, before a client's willing to do business with you, they may come and say, well, what protections do you have in place? What certifications? Do you have cyber insurance? At what are your limits? And you have to start answering these through due diligence questionnaires. So if you can't, I think it's going to hit you now in a lot of different areas, not just insurance.
Yeah, last thing I'd say is, Dr. Jerry, you're obviously the expert from the security side, but in the past, when we used to talk with clients, larger clients understood the value, CFOs, they understood why cyber insurance was needed. And I think one of the challenges we have when we're engaging with clients is talking about the fact that size doesn't matter. I don't think a lot of the people out there with malicious intent who are doing phishing campaigns, et cetera, they're not specifically targeting larger organizations. And one thing I've personally seen is I've seen a bigger adoption in more of the SMB mid-market, where smaller companies are finally realizing that, cyber insurance is important. Making sure that they're checking these boxes and doing that due diligence is important, because, as I said earlier, if you're a small company that happens to have a breach, the reality is the financial impact on your business, and there's a ton of statistics about, business companies going out of business when they're breached. But in my opinion, that affects smaller business more than it does larger businesses, just because they don't have the resources to work through those scenarios. So I guess my comment is just I feel like there's a huge need for smaller business to think about these things, because people with malicious intent are just not targeting specifically enterprise clients, which I feel like is kind of a misconception that's out there in the industry. Would you agree with that?
I do, and I think that's a big takeaway that I hope the viewers, if nothing else, you take this away, is that things evolve over time. So to your point, years ago, they were making targeted attacks against companies that could either pay ransoms or that they could sell information and benefit from. But there was a shift that occurred over the last 10 years where the internet now became a marketplace to buy tools to attack others. So now, instead of having a nation state or an actual true hacker like we think about hackers when you see in the movies that can do all these, fantastic things with computers, now anyone who's got the ability to get on the internet and go out to one of these sites can buy prepackaged software that one of these smart geniuses put together, and they can just launch attacks against thousands of companies on the internet. And if you happen to be vulnerable to whatever their attack is, you basically come back as a result, and then they come after you further. So they may not even be targeting you. So I think, step one is just get rid of the idea that they're targeting you. They're targeting a large swath of people, and you just happen to be in that net and we're vulnerable. The other thing is the cost, like you said. Yes, the bigger organizations have the funding to do this, but I think companies really need to pay attention to something else called due care and due diligence. It's unreasonable to expect a company of any size, let's say, to pay $100,000 to protect a $1,000 asset. But courts will say, what do your peers think is reasonable? So if you spend $100 a month on cybersecurity and you're ideally trying to protect $1 million worth of, let's say, patient data, you're going to be hard pressed, if sued after an attack, to go into a court and defend you knew you were sitting on $1 million worth of data and you spend $100 a month. That's the piece that, where due care and due diligence comes in, that I think a lot of folks just don't understand, that if, again, we just assume we're going to be attacked at some point, how will I defend that I made the best decisions possible with the finances I have? And when you really think about these things, I'll just make up numbers. Let's say a company could spend $1,000 a month to secure themselves at an adequate rate. $1,000 a month might sound like a lot, but when you consider the deductible on a single claim, you could spend $1,000 a month for the next 20 years and not equal the deductible. So what are the odds you'll be attacked in the next 20 years? And oh, by the way, if you were doing those things, maybe one, you weren't attacked, maybe two, you were paying a lower premium, and three, if it did happen, your deductible would have been cheaper. So there's so many ways you can slice and dice this, but I think, I said two takeaways. One was already covered. The second was, you don't have to understand the technology and the security specifically. You don't have to be a technical guru. Go out and just stay current on events and security webinars like this one, because things evolve. And we've covered kind of two ransomware attacks here. One of the things that's evolved with ransomware is attackers are very rarely now just encrypting and asking for a ransom. There's a lot of technologies and tools to help people avoid paying the ransom. Now they're actually exfiltrating data and then saying, here, I'm going to let you get a sneak peek to prove I took your data. Pay me back or I'm going to expose your data and all your customers will find out. And then you talk about your reputational losses. So just knowing that ransomware has evolved in that manner, it should make you rethink, how do we tackle ransomware? It's not just about backups anymore.
Sure.
Hope that helps.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to this is, during my time as a BCIO within the Purple Guys and working with our clients, about 6 years worth of time. During that 6 years, the process by which you apply for cyber liability insurance has increased in the scope and in the total number of questions. And so much so that, with travelers, for example, you actually have two different documents that you have to go by. You go by the normal application process, and then there's also an MFA attestation. And that MFA attestation is specific to certain levels of controls, if you will, that require you to have MFA to safeguard that particular asset or those particular assets. So, you know, one of the things that we do with the Purple Guys is we answer those questions for you and submit it back so that we know that if we are answering yes, that there is something in place, or that we are attesting that something is in place, that we are in fact, it is in fact there, so that way that you avoid potentially or hopefully eliminate the risk associated with a claim being denied. Most of our security offerings that we have in place are specifically built for the to answer yes to these questions. So you know, that's one part of this equation is you can't just say yes and not have that control in place. You have to make sure that the control's in place and that you can show proof that's in place so that you can fight that claim if you need to.
Yeah, I'd even recommend to folks, I'll use a calendar year as the fiscal cycle. I know everybody's got a different fiscal cycle, but for argument's sake, let's say it's calendar year. If you don't have a policy, but you're thinking about getting one next year, I'd recommend here in Q4, go out and get a quote. What it's going to do is, to your point, it's going to make you go through the application process. You're going to see what your carriers are looking for and how much it's going to cost. And then you can come back to your own organization and say, hey, you know, we're missing MFA and this is a requirement, or this is causing us to pay higher premiums if we accept this policy. And now, as you're doing your budget planning for 2025, you can say, I wasn't planning to spend on MFA, but I really need to. What's it going to cost? Where do I get it in the budget? If you wait until June of 2025 when you're planning to sign up and then you fill out that application, you might be hit with something that you couldn't plan for, budget for, et cetera. So there's a lot of opportunities to do this stuff in advance. And this goes for folks who already have insurance policies. You can always go back and look at what could I add and what would that addition do for me from a premium and deductible perspective. Some of these, I've spoken with a lot of folks, some of these solutions will literally pay for themselves. You know, if you can spend 10 grand on a solution and save $50,000 on a premium, it paid for itself. And now you get the added bonus of improved security and lower cost. And maybe with some of those savings, you can put some of those other controls in place. The other thing I would mention is, on a control perspective, go out and get certified in something. Go get a SOC 2 certification, go get an ISO certification. That will require you as an organization to put controls in place and keep them in place. So one, it's going to give you and your clients, you know, a higher comfort level. But two, then when you do go to deal with insurance providers and other audit firms and things like that, you can just hand that over. And then someone else, a third party, has already attested these things. You don't have to go through the rigor of proving each thing that they ask for. So a lot of things you can do here to help yourself out.
So, Dr. Jerry, as we're coming to the end of this, I'd ask one thing. You know, we've covered a lot of stuff, a lot of different controls, a lot of different ways that clients can safeguard their environment. My personal experience, and again, you know, as a security expert, you tell me if you disagree, but this is just going on conversations I've had with clients, is majority of the breaches in an environment is a mistake by an end user, right? An environment is only as secure as the weakest link. We can put you know, multi-factor authentication. We can have different security tools and controls in place, but really, in the end, in my opinion, it's about end user awareness and making sure that the team is diligent and they're questioning things that look off. And if something doesn't feel like you know, a process, a procedure, an email they normally get, ask. Would you agree that is probably the number one thing clients can do? And maybe there's other things too, but just your opinion on that.
I mean, from a percentage standpoint, if you were going to say what is the greatest attack vector, it usually is email and phishing attacks and the end user. More than 90% of attacks start that way, you know, successful ones. So I would say that is the area you should put the most focus. However, having said that, some simple things like MFA and EDR, I kind of go back to my analogy. You know, let's say we were talking about a hotel. we don't want to put all of our stock into the lock on the front door at the hotel and then leave all of the individual rooms unlocked, right? We're going to put locks on every door. So if someone does get past the front door, they don't have access to the rooms. So we want to limit and contain to the best of our ability. And I think that's what the other tools do. One, they limit and contain, and two, they slow attackers down. Think about this just like a car thief. You know, when you watch a lot of news reports, you'll see car thieves will walk down the street and just lift up the handle of each car. And whichever one happens to be unlocked, that's the one they steal. So just simply locking your car could have prevented that. You throw MFA on there, you throw EDR on there, you make it enough of a challenge that the person doesn't want to waste their time, they move on to the next organization that didn't do the same things you did, and they attack them. So just make it more difficult for them, likely will save you from being attacked. Not that they want to try it, but that they won't be successful.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, we know we're coming up on time. Don't have a ton of questions. Haley, I don't know if you want to go through the questions, see if we have anything out there.
One of the questions in the chat was whether or not the meeting or this webinar would be recorded and be available. Yes, the answer to that should be yes. We are going to publish it, and everyone will have access to it.
Yeah, and the other one, Ntiva and the Purple Guys, we all have various forms of gap assessments to look at your security posture, your risk posture, how well you're set up to pass certain certifications, et cetera. So yeah, absolutely reach out and we can help.
I did get an email question asking about how our organization can help people with these issues. And if the clients do their part, do we have the rest of it covered?
Yeah, as MSPs, obviously we can provide all of the technical tools and solutions that you'll need. We can provide the security resources, the knowledge, the assistance. We can provide all of the, the IT needs to get the environment to where it needs to be so that these tools and services will be effective, as well as we can do, help out on the soft side with the business impact assessments, privacy impact assessments, security impact assessments, all of those things where our job is to help you identify business and cyber risk so that you can boil it up in your organization, get it in front of the right folks and say, what's our risk appetite? How much of this do we want to accept? How much of this do we want to try to mitigate? And then once you make a decision on what you want to budget for and mitigate, you can come right back to us and we can put things in place. There's very few things that we can't do. I will say, just coming from the federal space, there are some technologies that are so expensive that they aren't applicable to small businesses, but more and more we're seeing organizations in the MSP channel space that are going out and filling those needs by creating alternative products. You just may not always be able to get the brand name that you hear on TV at the price point you want.
Yeah.
If anybody else has any questions, you can feel free to drop them in the Q&A again, just a reminder.
Yeah, there's a question in there just got posted. The question is, how can I sell the business on cyber insurance? It's relatively expensive, and I think the risk to not having it is being underestimated.
You've got a couple options. I mean, fear is what the industry uses quite a bit. I would say it's more about the statistics. So right now, I think the average ransomware attack costs a company something like $1.4 million. What's left out about that is how long were they down, how many of their customers left them, what contracts were they unable to fulfill, were they sued after? So you can bring a lot of that data into it. But again, I think the better thing would be work with us or your MSP to actually talk to the providers, because again, in a lot of cases, if you implement certain security services and tools, the providers will drop their premiums low enough that it pays for itself. And now it makes it affordable. If you go into it without these things in place and without the controls in place, they are going to price it out of your range simply because they don't want to take on the risk. So the more you can lower your risk and show them you're a less risky client to them, the more they will lower premiums and deductibles, and we can help with that.
Yeah. Well,
all right, we're up on time. Mark, if you want to closing remarks.
I just want to say I thought that was an awesome presentation. Thank you, Dr. Jerry and Iram. I think these are incredibly realistic, real world scenarios that just unfortunately get overlooked by a lot of clients based on size, et cetera. So great job. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Hope it was helpful to everybody.
There is one more question that just got asked. Last minute. It says, many on the call are not in leadership positions. Will you be providing one more concentrated training on what they can do to prevent this from their level?
Yeah,
I think that would be a discussion to have with your IT partners. Certainly, the Purple guys, we can provide these services. We can provide that training. We can provide that coverage, and we can go over that in more detail. Certainly reach out to us and let us know your current MSP if you have one, your current IT provider. But between Ntiva and the Purple guys, we have the expertise to be able to cover that with you. That's going to be very industry specific, or a scenario where we're going to need to know a little more information on what your circumstances are like.
Yeah, Haley, I would offer this. If we want to send out, a follow up to this with the recording and contact information of how clients can reach out to us. In my opinion, at the Purple guys, we're here to create value for prospective clients, whether that means they do business with us in the future or not. So if any questions come out of this that we can help clarify, validate that what you're doing is, the proper course of action, we're happy to do it. So we'll make sure there's contact information set out. And if we can help in any way, don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thanks everybody for joining.
Yep.
Hope you found it informative.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Jerry. Thanks, Iram. Thanks, Haley, for putting this together. Really appreciate it.
Welcome.
Bye-bye.
Have a great one, Anthony.